I was at grammar school at Dunstable in Bedfordshire. And I remember the war being declared. I was, 14, 15. Born in 1924, 24 from 39, 15, isn't it? So I was 15 when the war started. And I remember listening to Neville Chamberlain's speech. But it really didn't mean anything in a way. I didn't feel it was an earth-shattering thing. One of the big problems is to actually remember back how you were affected at that time. And anyway, that was it. I was at school for another 18 months while the war was on, and there wasn't much going on in the first year, as you know from history. So it didn't, and food was still plentiful. I was living at home with my mother in Dunstable as a day boy at the grammar school. And I had a very happy grammar school, and I've always had great gratitude for grammar school education, the standards that they taught me and the companionship. And it's thinking back, there were 4 of us very good friends, and I was the only one who wasn't in the services. And the other 3 all went down in the war, all three. So you don't think of that at the time, but afterwards you think, well, one was in the Fleet Air Arm, one was in the Air Force, and the other was in the Army. And not one of the 3 survived. I mean, that was probably exceptional. The hockey team I was in, 6 of the 11 were killed. So when you drag up old photographs like this, you think, it could have been me. But for circumstance, but I wasn't, well, at that age, I wasn't anything like military age, of course. So I got a job for the first year of the war at Vauxhall Motors, which was near Dunstable, making tanks and Bedford trucks. I was in the employment department, which was responsible for the records and the facilities for all the. It was a very, very large factory, talking of thousands of people. So I was very involved in keeping these records. So, of course, I got the job when I went back 3 days later. The factory was closed for about 3 days, and it fell in my thing, and that wasn't very pleasant as a very young man. It was my first real exposure to the fact that war could be very nasty business. But that's all I can say about it, really. It's my most vivid memory of working at Vauxhall. I didn't like it at all because most people wanted to work every minute of the day to get money. Well, I didn't. I wanted to be off seeing Beryl. So I wasn't sorry when I was able to get it. Well, if I'd stayed again at Vauxhall, I presume I would have been called up a year or 2 later when I became of call-up age. I don't imagine it was a reserved occupation. So again, my life would have been completely different. So I haven't really got much to say about Vauxhall Motors. It was a job I had to do when I left school. I had to get a job, and that was available. During the war was junior clerk in the employment office. I didn't know anything about Bletchley or anything else. And we did suffer quite a heavy bomb raid there one August afternoon. And that possibly is the most dramatic day I ever experienced in war. But the strange thing is, it was my first bombing experience, and I thought it was the end of the world. But later on in the war, I happily spent nights in London with a friend in Dulwich, knowing that I was going to get bombed. It's strange how you become accustomed to what's happening. Anyway, during that year, now this is into the Bletchley Park era, I was, then about 16, I fell in love with a girl who had got billeted to the same village that my grandmother lived in Bedfordshire. And I used to visit there a lot, and I fell in love with Beryl. I was still at school, and she left school at 14. At grammar school, I went on till 16, so she'd got a job at Bletchley. Well, he hadn't got a job. She was directed. You were directed by the Ministry of Labour. You didn't know what. And one time she said, my boss has asked that if we know any young men under military age, we'd like to know because we need... And I thought, I should see Beryl every 5 minutes of the day now. So, yeah. So that's how I got to Bletchley. I wasn't actually directed there, but of course, once you were there, there was no way you were going to get out. If you decided then to join the army, they'd say, "Okay, we'll have you back here within 2 weeks." So that's Bletchley Park, and I was there for 5 years, all through the war. This casual remark of hers, saying my boss, Freddie Freeborn, is saying if any of you girls knows of any young men under military age, put them in touch with us, because they were expanding then at BP, and that's how I went there. I had no idea what it was or what, but it was handy. I knew the area, and I was at Bletchley Park. I was in the punch card Hut 7, which you won't have heard about. It wasn't a glamorous Alan Turing and Tiltman and all these people. We were pre-computer mass data analysis on punch card. They'd made their name, Hollerith, processing a census, a national census, that sort of thing. And they decided that this mass analysis of German messages could be done much quicker than people poring over by hand looking for patterns. And this is what I was in all through the war. I wasn't a cryptanalyst. I wasn't trying to break any things. I was in charge. There were 6 teams, 5 on a rotational weekly basis, 5-week rotation, and the other mainly admin that were on permanent days. So at the age of 16, thinking about it, I was in charge of a night shift of probably about 25 girls, with 2 engineers from the company that made the equipment. And that was it. You didn't call for help in the middle of the night, So you took over the work that the day shift and evening shift had done and carried on a 24-hour basis.
Were these girls civilians?
Yes, they'd all been directed or called up because they were in their 18s and directed to Bletchley Park. And none of them had any idea what they were coming to do until they got there and were trained on this punch card equipment. Let's take the Enigma, the glamorous Enigma U-boat thing. And that's another thing about Bletchley. There were dozens of other ciphers that we were doing that weren't so glamorous and so important, I suppose. But we did German, Italian, Japanese, all the lot. Anyway, the German Enigma machine, it went on for 24 hours, and the traffic that was received in coded text was brought into our hut, and the girls transcribed this into punch cards. It's almost like tape it would be now or whatever. It was transcribing it into a workable format. And then we had to carry on an hourly basis until we were told to cut, and that would usually be mid-evening. And then we would go through the process of getting all this scrambled garbage data, alphabet, into order so that we could look for 4-letter, that's why we called it the Tetragram, clicks, repeats. And when we got these, we listed them out on a lister, a tabulating machine that would list any results we wanted to, and they would go then to the cryptanalyst with all the reference of the message on which the 4-click letters had been found. And from that, they did their work in cryptanalysis. But we could do it, as I say, much, much more quickly than they would have had dozens and dozens of girls doing this by hand. So that's basically, I mean, as I say, there were lots of other jobs which we were doing on Italian codes and Jap codes, looking for patterns that the cryptanalyst would help the cryptanalyst to crack the codes. Aside to that, we knew we were having a bit of luck towards the end of the war because they changed their key on the Enigma every second day. So normally, until well into the war, we had to do it every day until the new day came. But towards the end of the war, often halfway through the first night, we would get the message from the Turins and the cryptanalysts saying, OK, we've cracked it for another 2 days. So we got 2 days without the Tetra. So we got some idea then that things were, but we really didn't know what it meant. All we knew that somebody must be having some success. We knew what we were doing, and we were, as I say, looking for patterns to aid the cryptanalysts, the brains, the Turins and the glamour boys in Hut 6, who took our prints and then went to work on them. But we really had no idea. You never visited one of these huts. You knew it was a strange establishment because it was a complete mix of civilians. You'd see a guy in a civilian garb for months, and then suddenly he'd appear for a couple of days as a lieutenant colonel, and then go back to being a civilian again. And so it was a very odd place, but we didn't really question it and wonder why it was odd. It didn't make much sense, but it's the job to explain the underlying feeling, because we didn't have anything to go on. You had a thing around a disc with your photo on, and that you always had to show that to the MPs who went through the gate, the physical security. And one evening, 3 of us had been to the pub and we decided to climb the wall. And we climbed the wall, and there was a couple of snowdocks, we call them, MPs, because they had white helmets, waiting for us to fall in their arms. And we thought, oh my God, that's it. And Commander Barrow, the director of the whole thing, had us in next morning and treated us like children, as we were, really. So it was pretty. There was a large perimeter fence with a curve over the top. It took some getting over. So the physical security was very, very strict and severe. And if you lost your pass, if you couldn't go in, you had to go home and get it somewhere. And that meant waiting for transport, because we had to be transported back and forth to Bletchley. We'd got no transport of our own, and there were no buses. So they used to come and collect us at midnight or 3 in the morning or whatever times we were going on to a shift. I hadn't got a father. He died when I was 6, so he would have been the inquiring one. Mm. My mother, she was busy trying to bring up us children and make a living for herself, and I don't think she'd ever think about it. So the answer to that is I can't think of anybody that I knew. My landlady, indeed, she certainly never knew. She knew we were picked up, and in a way, I think there was so much oddity things going on that people took it for granted that, it's something we're not supposed to know about. And the war was their whole lives. So an odd oddity didn't really mean too much. And I don't believe that any of my acquaintances or friends, I didn't have many, they were all friends from BP, they never said, what do you do at BP? No.
How many people were working there, and how did you all get along?
Now, I've heard the figure of 10,000 mentioned. Well, there was nothing like that figure actually at BP. I mean, BP was the hub of the whole thing. When I say BP, it was never called Bletchley Park. We always referred to it all through the war as BP. Never heard it called anything. Anyway, that was where the final thing went on. But there were at least a dozen outstations taking in the stuff from radio, radio, I suppose. They would be WAFs mostly, wireless ops, and they would take the traffic down on the ether, and dispatch riders would bring it into Bletchley to be processed. I've forgotten the question now a bit. What?
How did you all get along?
Very, very well. As I say, there were in my particular Hut 7. We had a fiend of a boss, Fred Freeborn, and he was a dictator. But thinking back, he was very, very good for us because we were all 16, 17 and this, you know. And he was a very strict disciplinarian. But as far as people you were working with, as I say, I was head of a shift of probably up to 20 girls of varying ages, mostly sort of younger people, but some were quite senior. They'd all been directed there either from the British Tab factory that made this equipment, and they knew what they were coming into. Well, they didn't know what work they were coming into, they knew what equipment they were going to use, but all the other girls we had to train to use. There were about 5 different pieces of equipment which did a part of the process. So they had to be taught and then operate them. So I had about, as I say, up to 20 girls and 3 engineers, and we all got on extremely well. I don't remember any sort of personal things at all. And I'd say there were 6 shifts, 5 on a 5-week rotational basis, and 1 on permanent days. They were the admin people and the backroom boys who were. And another thing that's never mentioned about Bletchley Park is which we did our own cybersecurity as well. We made all our own secure codes, which is never really mentioned, but it was a very, very important part of what we were doing. It was quite aside. It was, in fact, towards the end of the war, they built another outstation at Drayton Parslow, about 3 miles from Bletchley, devoted entirely to our own. And some of the guys who I worked with were very, very brilliant with the programs. You'd call them programs now, to make this random alpha which couldn't be deciphered. I packed up on Beryl. She I don't know, you'll find this an amazing story, but I'll have to tell it. She confessed one night that she'd let the army truck bus driver kiss her goodnight at the garden gate. And that was it with Beryl. So then I became one of the lads and it was the sort of thing that in wartime, not small things like that, but small personal things, changed your whole life forever. I mean, I would have married Beryl and had a regular job, instead of which I became a pub crawler with all the lads and had a completely different life. And it, again, was a story I've forgotten again.
No,
but our social life was non-existent because you were in digs. Your landlady didn't want you. She'd only got you because the billeting officer had found she'd got a spare bed, and so she had to have 1 or 2 men. And so she didn't want you in the evenings, so there wasn't much else to do than go to the pub and have a pint or 2 with the lads. And of course, we got a long weekend occasionally between shifts, so you could go home if you'd got the money or the fare, because that had to be found, and money wasn't very plentiful. I was always in debt, but it was a good social life in many ways, even though by today's standards you wouldn't recognise it. I mean, there was no discos or music in pubs. You just had to sing your own music. But I don't feel I was deprived, really. It was just a different life, and you didn't know any different having come straight from school. VE Day. I remember VJ Day. Can I tell that?
Fine.
Because VJ, I was at BP on my own, and I'd got a great friend called Ron, and he was in digs, and he said, well, we can't celebrate for 3 days because it was the big thing, VJ. It was really the end of everything. And he said, you can come and have a bed with me for 2 or 3 nights. And I did. And his landlord never did know I was there for the 3 days. VJ was a great celebration, yes. But it was a very beery one. And as I say, it was... And the strange thing is, we expected our fighting war to start then, because I was 21, and we all expected then to be called up. We expected to be BP to completely pack up. There's no more point in, no more enemies to break messages off. And we thought we would then become members of armies of occupation in Japan and Germany. But then the three heads of staff, I can't remember their name, I think there was a Cunningham, and anyway, Army, Air Force and Navy, they all came down and thanked us en masse for what we'd done. And that's the first time we really knew that we had any notion of how important this had been. And they said, we've decided it's so important to be able to get into this straight away if there is an emergency, then as happened this time, it was 2 or 3 years before we were really into it. So it's been decided to keep it going. So, of course, we were all offered jobs, much to our amazement. I suppose the first bombing raid I had, and that was before I got to Bletchley, it was when I was at Vauxhall Motors, and it was one August afternoon in 1940, just before the Battle of Britain. And there was quite a heavy raid on the factory, and it was quite traumatic. The place shuddered and bombed, and there were quite a lot of people, casualties. And strangely enough, we all crowded into the loo. There were no shelters as such. These things, you remember these things. And I suppose thinking back, and yet, as I say, later on during the war, I happily went to London knowing that I was going to get blitzed.
Right.
But that was because it was unique. I'd never had a bomb drop on me near me before. If what we're told is true, that we did help shorten the war for a long, long time and possibly save a lot of lives, it is a very rewarding feeling that whereas we thought we were, well, shirking a bit, not being fighting soldiers, in fact we may have contributed more than if we had been. You see, I didn't really seriously regret not being able to join up because my father had died as a result of the First World War. He'd been gassed badly and had an eye shot out. My brother was flying Halifaxes in this war, and my mother had had a very hard time, and I thought, well, you know, we haven't done too badly. So it didn't worry me too much, but it was always there, the fact that we should have been flying an aeroplane or... In retrospect, yes. I mean, not at the time I wasn't proud of being there because we didn't really appreciate what a valuable contribution we were making. But when, some years afterwards, because don't forget, I carried on at the civilian Bletchley Park at Eastcote and then down at Cheltenham, where it still is. So we were still very much bound by the Official Secrets Act. I mean, you hear the people saying now, I didn't tell anybody for 10 years. You weren't allowed to. You were still very much bound because we were then trying to do, I won't say which countries, other countries' codes, which wouldn't have been too popular if it had been known. So we were still very, very... And people in Cheltenham in those early years had no idea what GCHQ, and it was an enormous establishment. Immediately at the end of the Japanese War, each of the three chiefs of staff, Army, Navy and Air Force separately, came and thanked us en bloc in the Assembly Hall. They had most everybody there. And they went on to say that it's proved so valuable to us that we realise that if ever there's another emergency, and don't forget there was still a Cold War looming then because communism was... that it's essential that we keep this going in peacetime so that we're ready to step straight in instead of having to spend a year or two, as we did this time, in getting in. It had been a great achievement, so great that they didn't want to risk it not being available in such a situation again of a sudden emergency, I think they called them. I was very proud of what we'd achieved when it was made known to us what we had achieved. But we hadn't known that while we were doing it. One delicate point of our work was not to let the enemy, we'll say Germany, as well as the Japs and the Italians, know that we were reading their codes, because that would compromise all sorts of things. In fact, we were very, very instrumental in sinking the Bismarck. Well, rather than the Bismarck know that we were reading their broken radio silence messages, we sent 3 swordfish aeroplanes up on a suicide mission because they knew they must get shot down, to make it appear that those swordfish had spotted the Bismarck where she was and radioed back. Now, I'm not sure I should say this, but there was one very, very doubtful thing about the Blitz in Coventry. Now, we were reading Luftwaffe codes, German Air Force codes, quite regularly. So we knew pretty well who was going to get bombed and roughly when. And the story was later on that it was known by Churchill that Coventry was going to be blitzed about 3 or 4 days before the event, and it could have been evacuated. But rather, to maintain this very, very importance of secrecy, that we were reading their codes, that wasn't done. And how many of those cases, it must have been a very, very delicate, difficult decision to make as to what to sacrifice in the cause of secrecy on our side, to make sure they weren't. And we were quite definitely, well, it was true, I think, that they didn't know that we were breaking their codes, because there was never an indication that they had any knowledge that we knew what was happening. And that was a very important part, which we had nothing to do with, of course. That was a political thing. But it was a very important thing to maintain secrecy. And for that reason, I think we were very careful on who we let know, allies or otherwise, what we were doing, for fear that their perhaps standards weren't quite